This example, we have a student class that we wanted to have a bunch of attributes. Specifically, we wanted to have an ID value of type string. Then we wanted the student to contain some contact information, and we decided to make that a separate class. And then we have an array which has all the current courses that the student's taking. So the objects or the elements of the array are objects of type course. And then we have a variable num courses that's keeping track of how many courses there's actually are in the array. So these are the attributes that this particular student class is holding and managing. So before we go on to look at the constructors and methods, let's look at the other objects that we had to create. So we had to create a contact. So I'll go to contact here. And the contact has 3 strings for the attributes. It has a mailing address, it has a phone, and it has email. Then it has one constructor which has no parameters, so we can create a new instance of contact without giving it any values. And then we have another constructor that takes the values for address, phone, and email. So we are assigning the attribute mailing address, the value of the parameter ADDR, and then the attribute phone gets the value from the parameter PH. And then lastly, the email attributes get the value from the parameter email. And then the last thing in this class is a toString method. And since object, the top Java class already has toString, we have this annotation add override, which means that we're taking an existing class that's method that's being inherited and we're changing the content of it. So this particular method is going to just format the attribute value. So it's going to have the name of the class contact and square bracket, and it's going to have little labels and then the actual value that's there to print out, and then it's returning that string. So back to student, that's the object that the student is holding, right? Contact. So contact again is an object. It has 3 strings, right? Mailing address, phone, and the email. And then we have this array, right, which is holding objects of data type course. And all we have for course is one attribute ID, and then it has a constructor where the constructor requires that you pass it the ID, and then that parameter gets assigned to the attribute. Okay, back to student. So now those were the attributes, right? So some attributes are just regular values, some attributes are a single object, and then we have an array of objects, and then we have a raw integer attribute, right? Different attributes you can have. And then the first constructor we have, or the only constructor actually, is where we are requiring that when the instance of the class student gets created, it must have an ID. So we are making the parameter get an ID. This ID value gets assigned to the attribute. And then we are creating a new contact object that has no values. And we are initializing our array so the current courses gets the memory allocated to allow it to store up to 20 objects, up to 20 elements, such that when the student class is created, right, it will have an ID, it will have a contact object, but the object will have no values, and it will have an array, but the array is empty, no elements there yet. This is important to remember because if you don't assign that any method later on that does something on that contact, right, on that attribute, if you didn't give it any memory, then it's going to be null. And so if you try to access it, it's going to throw the null pointer exception. So it's always important in a constructor to assign the memory so that it's guaranteed that when the object is created, it always has memory associated with it for all the attributes. All right, so then we have a method to add the contact data. So we have the method setContact. It takes as one parameter an object of data type contact, and then we just assign that value to the attribute. Okay, so if originally this student was created without that information, we can add that information later. And then we can also add a course. So we have another method which takes the course object as parameter, and then it assigns that object to the next available slot in the array, and then increments the number of courses we have. And then lastly, we have a method called getInfo, which is formatting the data so that the first thing is the ID label plus the ID value, then the contact information, which we are calling the toString method for that object, and then all the course IDs. So we need a little for loop to go through all the elements in the num courses array, and we are concatenating the value of the ID for each element to the string that we're building, the data string. And then once all this is added, then we're returning that string to the caller. Okay, so that's the basic setup, right, for the class. Obviously very simplified, but it gives you an idea of different types of attributes you can have. It gives you an idea how you pass a string versus some more complex data structure, and then how you can format data so that it can be, for example, printed out to the screen. So then in our test, we're going to execute some of this code to show that it works. So the first statement we have is we create a new instance of a student. The student ID is 12345. The variable is st1 for student 1. Then we are creating two course objects. The first one has for the ID MSE1234, and then the second one has MSE1235. And then we are adding each of the courses using the add course method. We are adding it to our student. So std1 gets the course C1, and std1 gets another course C2. And then we are printing out the information. So we're calling the getInfo method for std1, which is going to print all the information associated with that student. But remember, we haven't given it contact info yet. So when we print the getInfo, we should see that it's not going to have any yet, right? The contact information. So then we can create a brand new contact with the information, and then we can call the setContact method to pass it. So now we have a new contact in student 1, and then we just printing a space and then calling the getInfo method again to show that the contact information was added and now it's part of the student class. So if I run this program, first we're printing the student when it had ID, but it had no contact info. So you will see how mailing address is null, phone number is null, email is null, right? All these values are null. And then the course IDs are MSE1234 and MSE1235. And then the second line is after we added the contact information. So now the contact information is in there along with the other information we had. Now, if we did something, I mentioned earlier that it's important that you always allocate the memory, right? So let's say we did not assign this memory over here in the constructor student, right? Let's say we did nothing with the contact. So by default, contact would have a null value. So that means that if I was rerun this program, I'm going to have null pointer exception because the get info would try to access the contact.toString, right? And so that would fail because contact is null, and I will have an error. So that's why it's important to always allocate your memory such that even if it doesn't have values, your program will work. It will just show, as I ran before and I just reran, that the mailing address, phone, and email do not have values, right? But the program's able to access that information, that memory location, even though there's no values. So that's the difference between assigning a memory location even though there's no values versus not assigning anything and allowing it to be null.